Okay, hold on.
All right. So welcome
Okay.
everybody to the Rising Tide Foundation. So this has been a little bit of an ordeal. We just finally got on after some technical difficulties before. I'm very, very happy to announce that Martin Sieff is here, and he is going to give us a wonderful presentation on Lord Palmerston, the famous British guy. Look as a lack for a lack of better adjective. Martin, of course, has been giving us many, many wonderful lectures. And if you want to go to the Rising Tide Foundation, you can see some of Martin's presentations. One of them is called How the British Created and Destroyed Orwell. There is Teddy Roosevelt's Last Mad Crusade. There is The Lessons of the Titanic in Navigating Today's Treacherous Waters. And there is another one called Jules Verne versus H.G. Wells, Science Fictions Devoted to Good or Evil. And all wonderful, wonderful lectures by Martin. And I'm really looking forward what he has to say about Lord Palmerston today. Thank you, Martin. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And we'll jump right into it. We start at the end. Oh, let me make sure I have the date correct. Yes, October the 18th, 1865. 2 days before his 81st birthday, the most powerful man in the world for the previous 35 years died. There are conflicting accounts of how he died. The official account was that he had a stroke a couple of days before, and he had had a chill before that, which in those days of antibiotics could become fatal very or serious very quickly, especially for an octogenarian, a gentleman over 80 years old, and that was the official account. The unofficial account, which has wide credence in Britain to this day, is that at the age of 2 days short of 2 or 3 days short of 81, he, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, as was his wont, as was his usual habit, excuse me, was raping a teenage servant girl on a billiard table, pool in American terms. Now, this behavior was and remains to this day perfectly common practice at the country house weekends of the English ruling class. Uh, I've been a fly on the wall at a couple of such meetings myself. It's not the Hellfire Club. Things are done rather discreetly, and there's always good manners. But there's never any doubt about what's actually going on. Usually, from what I've seen, between consenting adults, but not always, and certainly not in the 19th century. How common this was, we will go into because it's well documented later on. The paradox, of course, is that Lord Palmerston, for the previous 35 years, had been the champion of abolishing the slave trade on the high seas, using the Royal Navy to suppress it. Yet the slave trade flourished during exactly those same years, especially to the Southern Confederate States of America. And this, of course, is a pattern we see to this day. But Lord Palmerston was a master at it, championing the rhetoric and ideology of liberalism and freedom and democracy around the world, while in practice doing the opposite. But this is a man who is quite extraordinary. When I say he was the most powerful man in the world, I mean it. Forget Donald Trump, forget Elon Musk, forget Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, who both reigned over and brought terror to the lives of hundreds of millions of people and killed multiple millions. Lord Palmerston was one of the three key figures ruling the one dominant industrial and military and naval power in the world for 56 years, from 1809 to 1865, in three key positions. There were a couple of times when he was out of office, most notably from 1841 to 1846, but these were simply blips on the scale. He spent, before he was 30 years old, he was head of Britain's Pentagon, so to speak, Secretary for War during the Napoleonic Wars from 1808 to 1829. He oversaw, financed, and supported Wellington's campaigns in Spain and in Belgium to destroy Napoleon. Afterwards, he approved and coordinated the military muscle that destroyed the Spanish Empire in across Latin America, from the Rio Grande on the border of the United States all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, a distance of more than 5,500, around 6,000 miles. Gigantic area. An empire that had existed for the previous 300 years. And under Palmerston, it was liquidated. Now, Western historiography, especially, of course, in Britain, teaches that this was an act of liberation. Of course, I had come to have my own skepticism about that, but more by gut feeling than anything else, before I long looked into it. But of course, it was not at all. My old teacher at Oxford, British to the core himself, the late Isaiah Berlin, the great political philosopher, and a man who regarded himself as being like a British patriot, but opposed to the British Empire in every form, he put it very well. The delusion of zero government bringing freedom, it does not. It frees everybody up, but that means that there is no restraint on the powerful to do what they want with the weak. Berlin was an avid freshwater fisherman much of his life, which he is not noted for. But the metaphor keeps coming into his political thought. It helped sharpen his focus. And the way he put it was, freedom for the sardine, very small fish, is very different from freedom for the pike, which is a very large predator fish. Both fresh sardines are in the ocean, of course, but Berlin liked to fish for pike, right? And the way he put it was, freedom for the sardine is freedom from being eaten by the pike. Freedom for the pike, you've got it, my dear, exactly, is freedom to eat all the sardines. And this is the freedom that Palmerston preached and practiced for more than half a century as head of the dominant major industrial power in the world. Now we talk about Alexander the Great. Just conquered the Persian Empire with horses, couldn't go very far, was stopped at India, right now, never really crossed the Indus River, died after 10 years. Julius Caesar, a mere provincial, conquers France, conquers Gaul, does a quick expedition to England, doesn't have the wherewithal and resources to stay there, comes back, regarded as one of the greatest conquerors of all time. Napoleon manages to run riot over all of continental Europe, but within 15 years of proclaiming himself emperor, no, 11 years of proclaiming himself emperor, because he proclaimed him in 1804, a decade later he's gone. Invading Russia, always a bad idea. Hitler, gone in 12 years, thank God. Stalin, unfortunately more impressive. A death toll that dwarfed, a murder toll that dwarfed Hitler's, including, incidentally, 1.5 million Jews. If Hitler had not cut loose with the Holocaust or had not existed, Stalin would be remembered today by the Jewish people as the greatest anti-Semite of all time. Now, he wasn't out to kill Jews specifically. He just killed everybody. But even there, 30 years, 11 time zones, only basically within the areas of Russia and the Eastern European countries that the Red Army occupied at the end of World War II. But what do we find with Palmerston? All of Latin America, Spanish America, 6,000 miles from the Rio Grande to Tierra del Fuego, give or take a few hundred, enslaved. Another old teacher of mine, not even a Latin American expert, but he actually bothered to analyze this. Dr. Not a name almost unknown, except to very specialist British historians, Dr. Hans Schenk. He was actually a Czech refugee from the Nazis and the communists, and his academic career was in Britain. In his book, Europe After Napoleon, he's focusing on Europe, but he also discusses briefly, but with serious scholarship, the quote-unquote liberation of Mexico and Latin America. And what's his conclusion? The standard of living of the native peoples of Mexico, of Ecuador, of Bolivia, what is now Bolivia, of Colombia, of Argentina, of Chile, collapses collapses when they become technically independent, but basically under the control of the City of London and operate at the behest of the British Empire. And we will see this pattern repeating itself. So, what Palmerston and his colleagues unleashed on Latin America alone dwarfs the great legendary conquests of Alexander the Great and Napoleon and Julius Caesar. But he was only starting. He was only starting. He does a bit of work against the Ottoman Empire as foreign secretary. He helps manipulate the rising of the Greeks, who certainly resented 400 years of Ottoman overlordship, though for much of that time, until around 1800, they far preferred the Ottomans to control by the Catholic Habsburgs and Bourbons operating out of Spain and Austria. In fact, in 1671, when the Holy League of Catholic empires is on the verge of destroying the Ottoman Empire is rescued and saved by a rising of Greek Orthodox Christians who would rather be run by Muslims than run by their fellow Christians who are, however, Catholic and not well disposed towards the Orthodox. They still remember the Fourth Crusade of 1203. So, but for Palmerston, this is small beer. We should make another point here, which again shows the complexity and ironies of history. Because whenever you talk about the British Empire and world conquest, the Jews and the Arabs always come into it or are brought into it. Palmerston showed no interest in either of them, and there was a very simple and revealing good reason. There was no money to be made from them. I have heard people, even often in our discussion groups, contributing afterwards and making the argument, oh, Disraeli was plotting to create a Zionist power in the 1870s and this, that, and the other. No, he wasn't. Disraeli was a Jewish romantic and a British imperialist, first and foremost, and all. And his basic policy was he risked world war with Russia and bullied Russia to preserve the Ottoman Empire at the Congress of Berlin in 1879. British policy until 1910 was to preserve the Ottoman Empire. Why? For the same reason Palmerston was interested in preserving it. It held back Russia, one, and Russia was regarded as the great enemy by the British. But two, the Ottoman Empire was destitute. It was filled with poverty. Nobody thought there were any resources in it. The internal combustion engine only becomes significant, as a hint of it in the 1890s, really becomes significant in the first decade of the 20th century when it's needed for automobiles and aircraft, biplanes, which suddenly come on the scene, both of them very quickly in the first decade of the 20th century. And then the main oil deposits in the world are in Texas, a bit less in Oklahoma, and secondly in the Caucasus in southern Russia. But very quickly, limitless resources are also found in the Ottoman Empire in what is now northern Iraq. They haven't found anything in the Arabian Desert yet, but there. But that's only in the first decade of the 20th century. And this leads Winston Churchill in 1910 to reverse 150 years of British policy to preserve the Ottoman Empire. From now on, Churchill is determined to annihilate the Ottoman Empire, and the British then embrace Zionism seriously. They'd toyed with encouraging it before, but just the way global imperialists always do, you have an iron in every fire, but it's very low priority. But suddenly, in World War I, Zionism catapults to the front, but only then. Palmerston, from 1808 to 1865, shows no interest in the Jews. And he shows no interest in the Arabs either. Why? Because this is the key to Palmerston and the British Empire. There is no money to be made from them. There is no wealth to be stolen from them. They are not worth being conquered and raped. But lots of other people are worth being conquered and raped. One thing I'll only touch on here, because here, especially with Jerry and Stephen in the audience, and Jenny, You and Tony, you have people who already know far more about what happened to the native peoples of North America, especially in Canada, than I do. But I raise this rhetorical question: what happened to them between 1808 and 1867 when the Confederation is formed? Did they have an easy time of it? What was their fate? And who was in charge of British policy at that time? But again, we are only scratching the surface. In 1848, we have already had what today we would call colour revolutions, supposedly popular revolutions that in fact are anything but popular, that are manipulated by the British government through the soft media, with the Royal Navy and British and imperial powers ready to move in and intervene, just exactly the kind of pattern we have seen throughout Eurasia and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics over the last 30 years, again and again and again. But this is a very old story. It goes back a lot longer than that. It really starts with Lord Canning in the 1820s. And Canning, remember, three people ran British policy. Lord Castlereagh, who was a conservative foreign minister, who was opposed to he's actually an old-fashioned conservative, but he commits suicide in 1821. Or does he commit suicide? This is a subject I believe has been discussed in these circles before. Jenny, you might want to speak on this. You have the look on your face of someone who knows she's drawing an inside straight on this one. And you know more than I do already. I can see this. I understand this, bless you. But I float this out as a question. And since Lord Castlereagh was a fellow Northern Irishman, the point is, while he is there, he is opposed to unleashing liberal democracy. He thinks it will get out of control. He thinks it will be abused. He thinks absolutely correctly that working class people will be enslaved around the world, or the people who we call now the middle class, who not exist in these countries. He believes, and he is absolutely right, as Spanish and European conservatives believe, that so-called free market democracy in those days, before counterforces are developed to control it and balance it or push it back and contain it, will only result in the monstrous enslavement of hundreds of millions of innocent people. And of course, he's right. But Castlereagh dies in 1822. And we are told he is prone to depression, and of course he commits suicide. Whimper, whimper, sob, sob. But who replaces him? George Canning, Lord Canning, to his death 5 years later, Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, and the architect of liberal revolution in both Europe and across the Americas. And who is Canning's partner in this? Already, it is at the age of only 42, and he has already been Secretary of War, running the British Pentagon since he was in his 20s, Henry John Temple, Lord Palmerston. Very important. Now, usually, as you all know, bless you for coming back despite knowing it all, I love to go off in every tangent imaginable. I probably will again, of course. But I want, first of all, to keep my main lecture relatively short. First, to prove, not so much to you, but to myself, that once in a million years I actually can. But the second reason is because Palmerston's life gives a framework to this. He is systematic. First, he rapes Latin America. And as my old professor, Dr. Schenk, pointed out, and nobody else really seems to have bothered doing this except the great J.M. Roberts, another fine, very honest British historian, half a century ago in his history of the modern world. Roberts points out, as did my old teacher at Oxford, who was Dean of Wolfson College at Oxford, Dr. Hans Schenk, that the standard of living of the native peoples of Mexico and Spanish America collapsed precipitously after so-called independence from Spain. Because the Spanish monarchy for more than 150 years, they were interested in digging out the gold and exploiting. And the general standard of living, as in the Ottoman Empire, was extremely low. But like the Ottoman Empire, they were not interested in driving it lower. In their own way, they protected the peoples who they by then who had accommodated themselves to them over hundreds of years. Many of the Catholic religious orders operating in Latin America. Was a very fine movie starring Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro on this very subject more than 30 years ago. And I should have looked up the title before he came in. If anyone wants to look it up, please do so. But it's about how a Catholic Church protected mini republics of native Indian people in the Amazon jungle, in the southern Amazon, I think in Paraguay, were annihilated when the religious orders were dissolved by liberal governments. So that, of course, the early big bad capitalists could take over and simply kill the Indians or rape them. At the same time, Australia is being settled. Most of the native peoples of the mainland are simply driven inland and impoverished. But in Tasmania, the British were in a recreational mood, and the climate and geography were different. You could fox hunt there, except there were no foxes, though horses flourished and cattle. So, what do you do if you want to do fox hunting and you're a British imperialist aristocracy in 1820s and 1830s Tasmania? You hunt people instead. You hunt the native peoples of Tasmania. And it's genocide. It's a total annihilation. They are exterminated. In the population of Tasmania today, there are virtually no genetic markers of the previous population, which was significant before the British came. We find the same pattern in Argentina. The native peoples of southern Argentina, of the Pampas, which is the equivalent of Ukraine in Russia and the equivalent of the Midwest in the United States, rich farm land that was virgin land with thick, rich soil, marvelous for the growing of wheat, marvelous for the raising of cattle. And of course, Argentina is the heaven for steaks and beef and meat to this day. You want it done, there is nowhere superior on earth to get outstanding steaks, not even in Tuscany or in Kansas City. Go to Buenos Aires. Go to Buenos Aires, right? But again, the land was cleared, and the British were involved in this too. They taught the local Argentinian aristocracy how to do it. They never did it in the time of the big bad Spanish and the big bad Catholic repression for the 300 years before this. But once they are liberated to the joys of liberal free market capitalism and democracy, early 19th century style by Lord Palmerston and his colleagues, they are quickly, and of course, especially after the railroads start coming in the 1850s, which makes it very easy to go down there. And very soon afterwards, you have American-designed excellent Winchester repeating rifles as well. You're not just killing the cattle. You literally annihilate, you don't just exterminate or reduce, you literally annihilate the native tribes of Argentina and across the border in Chile as well, but mainly in Argentina. But the primary impulse does not come from 300 previous years of ultimately tolerant and lazy, if impoverished, Spanish control. It comes after the Spanish crown has had control wrested away from it. An entire continent has been annihilated, and nobody notices. Nobody notices, right? We will come back to the issue of the slave trade in the Confederate States in a few minutes. But let us jump forward a little bit first to the 1850s. In 1855, Lord Palmerston, 1854, Britain goes to war with Russia. There is a ridiculous trumped-up reason for justification for this, which the British public eagerly buy, that Britain, being a good Christian nation, must inflict 2 or 3 million casualties, including 1 million dead, on another Christian nation, which is Russia, because A, they're the wrong kind of Christians, and B, they're claiming control of the holy places from the Turks. And as good Christians, the Protestant Christians, the British support the Muslim Turks against, of course, the evil Russian Orthodox Christians. This is the justification for the Crimean War in 1854 and 1855, right? Now, there are two perspectives on the Crimean War, the British and the Russian. And in America, it is the British conception, again, a triumph of brainwashing, a triumph of propaganda, a triumph of soft power, a triumph of bad culture, triumphing over even worse culture or literate culture. Lord Tennyson's famous poem. Remember, he's made a lord. The British establishment approves of Lord Tennyson. The charge of the Light Brigade. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, charge the 600. Da, 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 this, that, and the other, right? So in the British accounts, the Crimean War is ridiculous and absurd and bloody. But basically, we're the good guys, and it's just an obscure little issue with nothing. But the British Empire is fighting the supreme military land power in the world, Russia, and they beat them with French aid. We shall come back to the issue of why France aided them and the far-reaching consequences of that, not just for Britain and France, but for the rest of the world. We'll be back there in a moment. But the British and the French have made an alliance under the misnamed Emperor Napoleon III. And for the next 20 years, the two countries together run riot across the world. First, they destroy Russia. The Russians lose 1 million dead in the Crimean War. The Crimean War is not just a bad poem by Lord Tennyson. For them, 1 million people are killed, and it leads to a revolution internally in Russia. The old Tsar dies, and a new Tsar, arguably the greatest Tsar in history, the martyred Tsar, the great liberator Tsar, Alexander II, takes over from his repressive father, Nikolai I. Now, Nikolai I was a real conservative in the most literal sense of the word, which is why ultra-Orthodox know-nothing Jewish rabbis who hated modernity actually loved him so much, even when hundreds of thousands of their own people were starving to death because of Nikolai's policies. The rabbis approved of this. They didn't want science, they didn't want modernity, they didn't want tolerance, they certainly didn't want math, and most of all, they didn't want medicine, right? So they approved of what the Tsar was doing. If you were a moderate Jewish liberal in the 1830s, 40s, or 50s, you were murdered. You were not murdered by the Russian government. You were murdered by your own local hicks at the behest of your own ultra-Orthodox rabbis. That's who murdered you back then. But Alexander II is a modernizer. He creates a Jewish middle class, he creates a Russian middle class, he brings railroads to Russia. Why does he do these things? We'll go into that a little more later. But the basic reason is Russia had been raped by the British Empire in the Crimean War because the British had steamships and modern cannon and much more modern muskets and weapons and rifles, and the Russians did not, and the Russians had none of these newfangled railroads, so the British were able to deploy, and the French were able to deploy power commanded from London and Paris, whereas Moscow, which was basically the local capital for the Crimea, could not get only a fraction of the troops down there, and also, although disease ran rampant with the British and the French, the beginnings of modern medicine were there under the famous nurse, Florence Nightingale. There was no conception yet of modern medicine in the Tsarist Empire. So Nikolai I dies a failure. He doesn't appear to have been murdered, but he dies in 1855. And he is replaced by his son, the greatest of the Tsars, who is determined to bring modernity to Russia. But this is the first example, and we shall see more, where Palmerston's aggressive policies of raping the world backfire upon him. He is determined to rape Russia, and he does so. What he really wants is to get access to Ukraine and to break up the Russian Empire. But instead, in a pattern which we now see today repeating itself under Vladimir Putin, the Russians do not fall apart. They react to the shameless rape of their resources and of the resources of Ukraine by the West by coming together and seeking to modernize instead. Just as the catastrophe of the Yeltsin decade in Moscow following the collapse of communism was followed by the re-establishment of Russian power and centrality and a coherent nation state, and the raising of the standard of living of the Russian people over the past 25 years under Vladimir Putin. Now, I did not read about any of these things in books. I didn't have to. All the books are lies. I was there repeatedly. for the Washington Times in the 1990s, for United Press International in the first decade of the 20th century, and wearing other journalistic hats in the second decade of the 20th century, I saw the improvement. I saw the terrible downs, much worse than the Great Depression, as I have said here before, and I saw the remarkable recovery of the Russian people over the last 25 years as well. You can't believe everything the New York Times tells you. I know this will come as a terrible shock to everyone here. Magdalena, exactly. I'm sorry to have outraged you so much, to have shocked your sensibilities. There are people I went to Oxford with whose sensibilities will be shocked by this, who will not talk to me anymore because they think they're the wisest fucking people in the world. And this one comment exposes them as fools, ignorant assholes, ready to allow hundreds of millions of people to suffer in destitution just so that they can feel virtuous and good. We can call it the Greta Thunberg syndrome. Greta Thunberg syndrome. I just came up with that, but quote me on it endlessly. At my age, especially, I can use my friends to be my PR agents all the way, folks. Right now, what we see today, this is one of occasionally there will be others, where when we look at what Palmerston and his colleagues did in the 19th century, 170 years ago, we actually see then the seeds and the precedent for what we are seeing today across the world. The destabilization of stable governments that have a sense of social responsibility for the poor and suffering among them in Latin America. Hillary Clinton, there is strong evidence that Charles Ortel and others have gathered, ordered the assassination by targeted special cancers of left of center reforming social democratic governments and leaders all across Latin America. There was certainly a policy of destabilization in great nations like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia. I've left a few out, but there will be more. And this was energetically pursued by Hillary Clinton and her neoliberals, who are indistinguishable from neoconservatives, of course, when she was Secretary of State from 2008 to 2012. And who were her two most trusted and energetic and mindlessly obedient thralls or lieutenants in the Obama administration at that time? You may have heard of them since. One Antony Blinken and one Jake Sullivan. The terrible, the dynamic duo like Batman and Robin, who masterminded policy to send the Ukrainian peoples to their deaths in what was going to be from the start a hopeless war against Russia when the Russians saw it as an existential threat to them. And they start off under Hillary Clinton, but the policy actually goes back to Palmerston in the 19th century and to Canning. The creation of fictional liberal causes that do not benefit ordinary people at all, but instead strip them of their traditional protections and send them into destitution and enslavement and even genocide, so that the major capitalist markets from Paris and London can benefit instead. Where does France come into this? For 140 years, from 1670 to 1815, France is Britain's existential enemy. It's public enemy number one. The two are the great rivals to conquer the world, well, since they are the two great military and most of all naval technology powers in the world. And although France is much larger and has more resources and a far larger population, they have a much more inefficient banking system and financial system, and they are very poor. They are idiots when it comes to economic policy, and they are way behind the British when it comes to the application of applied technology in the economy to make money. The British are light years ahead of them. Light years ahead of them. So the British win. The British finally win by fooling the French in 1786 into free trade. This is the real reason for the French Revolution. The collapse of standard of living of French artisans, the nearest thing to a middle class they had, actually just basically a more survivable working class, and of regular peasantry, is tolerable until 1786, when King Louis XVI very much an Al Gore figure, an idiot, a well-meaning, enlightened liberal who like Yeltsin, who believes all the pablum he reads in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, or in those days the Times of London. And he's read, God help him, Adam Smith, and he believes Adam Smith. So all you have to do is demolish all trade barriers and protection against imports flooding into your country, and prosperity will follow. What could go wrong? Everything goes wrong. The British keep their own very protected economy protected under the Navigation Acts and other laws that were passed by Oliver Cromwell very ruthlessly but very sensibly in 1650, 140 years earlier, 136 years earlier. The British keep those barriers, but they talk the French into dismantling their barriers. So a flood of short-term enormous profits comes to England and to British manufacturers, not to the British people who are being treated like English people who are being treated like slaves, but to their owners, to the mill owners, to the speculators, to the aristocracy. The wealth floods in. Within 3 years, France has collapsed, and you have the French Revolution. Adam Smith and free market economics have destroyed a government, the oldest, strongest, most traditional government system in Europe that has flourished since the days of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, 1,000 years before. That's what Adam Smith and free market economics does to you. And it does today as well. The irony is today it's the American people who have been suffering from it, just so that their own betters and masters can get fatter profits. Alex Kreiner, all of you know this, and of course Alex Kreiner is a superlative expert on this, as is Matt, as is Cynthia, as are you all. But we see this back in the French Revolution, and we then see Lord Palmerston energetically applying it to the whole world. Now, Palmerston only becomes Prime Minister when he is 70 years old in 1854-55. And it's rather like Churchill taking power in 1940. Most, even in the English aristocracy, don't like him and they don't trust him. They know he's a rapist. If you look at the cover, you might want to look up the image of Palmerston online. And the best image is the image Matt used wonderfully. I was going to ask him to actually use that very image, and he just used it anyway before I had a chance to introduce this lecture. A photograph, because photography had come in from after the late 1830s. So we have photographs of Lord Palmerston in his old age. The portraits of Lord Palmerston that are painted of him, because he's already one of the most powerful men in the world before he's 30, show a tall, handsome, imposing aristocrat. But that's not what the camera reveals. The camera reveals in his 70s and 80s, in his 70s, an ape, a beast. Now this is very interesting because he follows Darwinian policy. But Darwin has not published his book yet. The argument is usually made, and Herbert Spencer certainly pushed it along, and people like Winston Churchill did not believe in God, certainly did not believe in any Christianity. Churchill was open about this all his life. But he did believe in Darwin. Because for the English ruling class, Darwin is wonderful. Darwin justifies you to kill and rape and steal and destroy without limit, and you have a perfect conscience. You're doing the universe's will by doing it. But Darwin does not tell Lord Palmerston what to do. Lord Palmerston tells Darwin what to write and think. I don't mean that literally, but he doesn't have to. Because the whole British Empire through the first half of the 19th century, first 2/3 of the 19th century to the death of Palmerston, already has been an empire of rape and stealing and genocide and crushing and oppression. In the 1850s, nobody wants Palmerston to take over for the same reason no one in Britain wanted Churchill to take over in 1940. They didn't trust him. Churchill was recognized as having sent hundreds of thousands of British young men to their deaths in Gallipoli and invading Russia, and in the later campaigns of World War I. His attempt to crush the Irish rebels in the Irish War of Independence had failed miserably. Churchill was a brutal thug who had admired Mussolini, and worse than that, he was a glory-hunting, absurd, pompous, full of shit 18th century fool. Clement Attlee, who defeated Churchill in every one of the three elections they fought against each other. The British people never voted Churchill into office, just as the German people never voted Hitler into office. In every election that Churchill fought, his opponent, the Labour Party leader Clement Attlee, won more votes than Churchill did on three occasions. In 1945, right after being Britain's triumphant war prime minister, Churchill was rejected by the British people in July 1945 by the biggest popular landslide in British political history ever before or ever since, because they knew him. And you know where most of the votes to reject Churchill came from? They came from soldiers who were serving in the British Army in Italy and North Africa and Western Europe and in Burma, who knew that Churchill was full of shit because they were following the disaster and the widows and orphans of the 55,000 boys he sent to their deaths and a totally unsuccessful bombing campaign over Germany in World War II. All the glorification of Churchill was not there when I was a boy or a teenager. It comes to Britain only when the generations who knew Churchill at first hand were safely dead. So why does he become Prime Minister in 1940? The same reason Palmerston does in 1854. Because Britain is in a major war against the supreme military power on the European continent, and they are run by fossilized old passive twits who clearly don't know what they're doing. It's Lord Aberdeen in 1854 and it's Neville Chamberlain in 1940. So on both occasions, the attitude is, God help us, we've got to get that energetic old fool in after all. He's a monster, he's an incompetent raving idiot, but at least he'll kick some ass and get things done. And of course they do. Churchill did in 1940, though the story on that is a complex one, as you all well know, and an ironic one. And Palmerston does in 1854. And of course, Palmerston is based this bluff because the Crimean War does not succeed in its main strategic aim. The British are so incompetent that even though they are fighting an 18th or even 17th century obsolete military in the Russian Empire that has no industrial muscle or weight or weaponry or machinery behind it at all, they still can't move inland. They still can't do anything. So they have to settle the war, and in classic Churchill terms, they then have lots of sound and fury and lots of big parades to celebrate a victory, and it's really BS. One remarkable and unusual person in Britain is not taken in. Queen Victoria. She sits on top of all of this. But again and again, you find during her reign, she has no real power to change to rein in the out of control rapists and war criminals and murderers who are actually wiping out the world. But she, bless her, actually believes the rhetoric of, a Christian empire, good and kind and virtuous and true. And, the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton and all this bilious, childish nonsense. She doesn't like Palmerston. She is the mother of, I can't remember if it's 6 or 8 kids, so perhaps somebody will look it up for me and give us the exact figure, but she's very happily married to her husband, Prince Albert. So she's not an innocent person personally. And she knows that when Lord Palmerston comes to Windsor Castle or to Balmoral, none of her ladies in waiting is safe. He will try and rape them, and often he succeeds. And this is common knowledge. So she doesn't actually like him, but he's there. Now he's already 71 years old, and this is 19th century, middle of the 19th century. They're just the idea of a sterile operating room is still science fiction. Nobody dreams of antibiotics or penicillin, doesn't even dream of them for another 80 years. Life expectancy is very low, and not just because you're enslaved by British and American free market industrialization in the name of liberty. It's still going to be very low. Palmerston is already 71 years old. How long can he be there? The answer is pretty much forever, the next 10 years. And unlike Joe Biden, he really is there. So first, he rapes Russia, kills 1 million people in Russia in the Crimean War. It gets British nowhere, but he declares a victory anyway, and the British public love him. And they know all about him jumping on terrified and disgusted teenage servants on billiard tables. And that just makes him more popular because that is the kind of society 19th century England is. Doesn't stay that way. One man above all works overtime and has a remarkable job in civilizing the English in the 19th century. And that man is not a politician, of course. He is a writer. He's a writer of popular fiction. I know Oxford graduates in English literature to this day who turn up their nose at him and of course he did so much good. That man is the most powerful English writer of fiction and drama since William Shakespeare, who of course was Christopher Marlowe himself. That man is Charles Dickens. The novels of Dickens teach an entire public across the Western civilization that it is not Christian to be cruel, that it is not Christian to work little boys and girls to death, or to rape them, or to murder them, or to have them die choking in chimneys because you could send them up them because only a 5 or 6 year old little boy or girl can climb up a giant chimney in London in the 19th century to clean it. Palmerston and his generation take these things for granted. It's the way the world is. It is the genius of Charles Dickens, who writes from the 1830s to his death in 1870, to educate and awaken an entire civilization. Of course, he's translated into other languages too, that these should not be acceptable modes of behavior. And of course, it still takes generations in the West to roll these activities back. But it's the road to civilization starts with Dickens, but Palmerston is before that. Palmerston does not beget Dickens. Palmerston begets Darwin. Palmerston begets Darwin. So Palmerston has finally gotten power, and the Crimean War is settled in 1855. Does he do a Joe Biden? No. Unlike Joe Biden, he's full of vitality and wit and intelligence and energy. First of all, there is a rebellion against the British Empire, which has had a loose control over India, still technically under the control of the Mughal Empire. And genuine horrific atrocities are carried out, though on a small scale, but they are horrific, against British settlers in India. Dozens, possibly more than 100, English men, women, and even young children are slaughtered, raped, cut to pieces, and thrown down a well in Cawnpore. Cawnpore was the 19th century term for it. Now, this kind of behavior, of course, happened on the Eastern Front in World War II and pretty much throughout Europe on an enormous scale all over the place. And even we in the United States, we firebombed around 1 million people to death in Japan. We burned 180,000 people alive in a single, two combined fire raids on Tokyo, higher death toll than both atomic bombs combined, multiplied by 2. Nobody bats an eyelid, right? How did the English respond to Cawnpore? It was horrific, it was barbaric, it was nightmarish, it was disgusting. It killed around 100 people. So they killed 1 million Indians, men, women, and children. Their preferred form of execution was to take captured Indian soldiers and strap them in front of cannons using advanced technology creatively again, just as we have done in our war against terrorism over the past 25 years. You see again how the past prefigures the future, and the future unconsciously learns and follows the worst of the past. They strapped Indian soldiers to the front of cannons, and they fired cannonballs through them. And many thousands died this way. And in all, they slaughtered at least 1 million, including, of course, untold hundreds of thousands of Indian women and children. And this war is still called to this day in Britain the Indian Mutiny. The Indian people, of course, and Indian scholars do not see it that way. They call it the First War of National Liberation. And you can see why. And after it is over, India is rationalized. In other words, the East India Company is abolished, and the Mughal Empire is abolished. And the pattern we saw in the abolition of liquidation of the Spanish Empire in the 1820s is also abolished. India will be remodernized, but it will also most of all be exploited and impoverished for the greater good of British imperialism. And the enslavement and poverty-stricken nature condition of the Indian people becomes a byword for the next 90 plus years. One of the arguments Winston Churchill uses in fighting independence for India, or even home rule for India within the empire in the 1930s, which was his main cause then, was the Indians, of course, are just Muslims and they're just Hindus. They're just savages. They need us. Take the kindly protective British rule over India away, and the Indians will collapse in poverty and despair. What has happened over the last, let's see, 80 years now in India, since the British were kicked out in 1947? The population of India has doubled, but the standard of living per capita of the Indian people has multiplied 10 to 20-fold. There has not been a single famine, which were endemic throughout the British Empire era to a much greater extent than they were under the Mughal Empire before the British took over. Yet there has not been a single major famine. The last one was in 1943 in Bengal, when Churchill allowed at least 3 million Indians dead. The British claim that's an exaggerated figure. Indian scholars have documented the death toll at 10 million, which makes it as destructive as the Great Famine in the Soviet Union from 1929 to 1932, one of the most destructive famines in history. The Indian famine could easily have been prevented because the ships to carry grain were there, and the available grain from Canada and Australia were there to do it. And both Australia and Canada, interestingly enough, were ruled by genuinely progressive, kindly, seriously Christian, left of centre rulers at that time. Mackenzie King in Canada hated and distrusted Winston Churchill and was a lifelong supporter and close friend of President Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, the best accounts we have of FDR's policies come from the diaries of Mackenzie King that were not released during his lifetime. And therefore, American scholars did not look at them. And being American scholars, they didn't think to look at any Canadian source either. Similarly, in Australia, Australia has a prime minister called John Curtin, who had been a conscientious objector against Churchill's bloodbaths in World War One, and Churchill hated him and only mentions his name briefly in his enormous and worthless 6-volume history of the Second World War with the greatest reluctance and disgust. And Curtin, like Mackenzie King, looks to the United States and the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt as the primary allies to win World War I against the dueling fascisms. Now, both of them basically leave the empire in 1940 to 1942. And since then, both Australia and Canada, and we both know the major efforts that have been made to pull them back in line. But de facto, there is independence during the war, and it is Churchill who creates the situation he least wants in both cases. Now we're back with Palmerston again. As I said, Palmerston unfortunately is no Joe Biden. I find it very difficult to find a single word to say in favor of Joe Biden. In fact, I find it impossible, and I'm not going to start now. But at least Biden was a nonentity. At least he was a tiny little worthless turd. He wasn't an activist. Plenty of monstrous things in Ukraine and Gaza and other places have been done with him happily and mindlessly scrolling X, since he no doubt isn't capable of writing his name now, if he ever was, down there. Palmerston is not like that. Palmerston is highly intelligent, dynamic, charismatic, ruthless. He's so ruthless that he shocks even the greatest slave owner and profiteer in the world at the time. His fellow cabinet minister, William Ewart Gladstone. Now notice we're still in the 1850s. What have we seen? Palmerston has raped Russia did not gain control of Ukraine, did not shatter the Russian Empire, but killed 1 million human beings, most of them peasants in Russia, in the Crimean War of 1854-55, that was fought for no sound reason at all, except the real reason was to try and seize the raw resources of Russia, where they failed, right? Then he puts down the Indian uprising, the first war of national liberation, and he kills 1 million Indians in doing so, even in a country as large as India. To paraphrase, I think, the late Senator Richard Russell, 1 million here and 1 million there, and very soon you're talking about real populations, right? He kills 1 million people in India. But to do that, he has had to bring much of the British Royal Navy and much of the British Army to India. You got to get all those cannons there so you can strap all those captured Indian soldiers in front of them and blow them away with cannonballs, right? Strapped point blank range to the bore of the cannon. You actually have to get the cannons there and the soldiers to man the cannons and the soldiers to fire them. Now, once you've got them halfway around the world, doesn't it seem a pity not to use them a bit more? Why waste them? So what does Palmerston do next? He destroys the civilization of China. He actually wages 2 Opium Wars against China. The first had been in 1839 to 1842. The first 2 years of that, he's Foreign Secretary of Britain and responsible for the direction of British foreign and strategic policy. And what is the war fought over? Again, there is a remarkably modern aspect to this. It is fought to civilize China, bring it into the world community, and force it to learn the virtues of free trade, which will bring unlimited prosperity, and democracy will follow. And of course, they have a terrible record in human rights. Actually, being an ancient Bronze Age, post-Bronze Age civilization, they have no concept of human rights, either fake or real in our terms at all. But they have their own way of doing things. And what followed is far, far worse. Hong Kong is wrested from China. Much more than that, the Manchu dynasty, which has ruled China with distinction through the 18th century and with increasing decrepitude still, but it is still there, is discredited and smashed by the outcome and humiliation of the First Opium War. It is called the Opium War because the free trade the British demand is the freedom to export into China unlimited quantities of opium that are absolutely vital and necessary for the continued prosperity of the British Empire. You see, the British people have gotten a liking for Chinese tea, and they drink huge amounts of it, and they import it from China. But the Chinese are not interested in any of the regular industrial goods or chattels that the British want to sell to them. But because the empire is declining, there is their equivalent of a fentanyl epidemic going on there. And the British encourage it. Opium. Opium is made in India. And the British don't let it circulate uncontrollably in the Indian Empire. They don't care much about the Indians, but all their slaves are no use for them if they're all dying of drug addiction at the time. Much better to ship them off to China and let them pay good money, and then they can die of drug addiction. What could go wrong? At the time, nothing goes wrong. It works. The war is fought in order to blow open the doors of China to the unlimited dumping of opium. It's as if the drug dealers, the fentanyl drug dealers, and the cocaine cartels in Mexico had modern weapons and were able to humiliate and beat the United States Army in a conventional war. The way things are going, not so far-fetched, I'm sure you will agree, right? And then America is still left wide open to unlimited floods of both cocaine and fentanyl flooding in, actually exactly what happened under Joe Biden again, right? In the name of free trade. And now we have President Donald Trump and his people trying to clamp down on this practice of free trade. Adam Smith would be furious at them. The Democratic Party is furious at them. Every professor of economics at Harvard and Yale and every columnist in the New York Times are furious at the president for these outrageous fascist Nazi policies to try and stop 100,000 Americans a year dying of drugs. How dare he intervene with the gods David Ricardo and Adam Smith? How dare he intervene with free trade? Lord Palmerston felt the same way, and he had the most powerful navy and one of the most powerful armies in the world to enforce it from 1839 to 1841. And because the British are not even pleased, they're making huge, obscene profits from the collapse of China, which has another consequence, because China collapses in total despair. And as a result, a new religious movement, again favored and fanned by British Protestant missionaries, sweeps southern China. It is called the Taiping. It, uh, uh, it is a fundamentalist Christian movement that is launched by a charismatic young clerk who failed his entry into the Chinese imperial service. It's rather like Hitler being turned down by the Vienna School of Art and Architecture, right? And then he goes into radical politics. Now, Hitler's art, as we well know, was execrably bad, right? And this young gentleman, Hong, would have made a terrible clerk and embarrassment to the imperial civil service. But better, both these repulsive little demonic assholes should have been swallowed up harmlessly than what they unleashed upon the world. Because Hung gets taken up by a British-backed Methodist missionary, and he decides to convert the entirety of China to Christianity. And it takes off totally, except it isn't Christianity in any normative Orthodox, Catholic, or for that matter, mainstream Protestant sense whatsoever. Hong just realizes, is led to realize with one revelation after another, that he is Jesus Christ's younger brother, and he will now do the job Jesus failed to do. Whenever you hear anyone saying they're sent on earth to do the job Jesus failed to do, or they're smarter or more successful or more brilliant or dynamic than Jesus, run for either kill the little bastard right off if you can, and if you can't, run for another continent. It is always a bad idea. Every time. Because within 5 years of this fucking little lunatic deciding that he's smarter and wiser and more successful than Jesus Christ, he has set off the bloodiest civil war in human history. It lasts for 10 years, almost 2.5 times the length of the American Civil War. The American Civil War kills, we now believe, 870,000 people. Mainly men. It's actually fought gentlemanly ways, except where Southerners get their hands on black soldiers. When the Union armies, except under Grant, really don't care about the protection of black soldiers, right? Or black slaves. But 870,000 killed, mainly young adult men. But the Taiping Rebellion and its suppression as well killed 50 million human beings in 10 years. They conquer half of China and they get out of control. It's rather like Matt's assessment of Hitler and the fascists in Europe. Very similar. You know, do they hit the communists? Good idea. Will they destroy the Soviet Union for us? Good idea. Oops, they're starting to turn on us and the French as well. Not such a good idea. Maybe we need to belatedly stop them after all. So the British change sides, and they send the imperial court in Beijing a general. He's famous for a much smaller and more obscure role in history much later. His name is George Gordon. He's known as Chinese Gordon for his role there. He ends up being martyred in the city of Khartoum by the Muslim fundamentalist leader, the Mahdi, 25 years later, in 1884, I think, right? But before that, he has taken over the imperial armies, and the slaughter they inflict on the Taiping is hideous. Since the Taiping claim to be Christian, though very weak Christians, now we must not idealize the Taiping. They were genocidal. If you didn't swallow when the Muslim armies conquered, they were tolerant. If you accepted Islam through the Dark Ages, you're in. The demands of the Taiping were rather more extreme than that. They simply exterminated everybody. right? And the societies and the farmland, everything. They exterminated everything. So Gordon more or less is on the side of not so much civilization, but the less barbaric of the barbarians. But it is a force that Palmerston had unleashed, and the British really don't care about as long as they get the profits in the from the cocaine and opium. Well, not cocaine yet; it hadn't been industrially refined out of opium yet. But as long as the opium trade can continue in an enormous flood through Hong Kong, which was expressly taken by the British from China and developed as the entrepot port precisely to pump uh, opium drugs into southeastern China. And the paradox, of course, is today the Pearl River Delta and the Guangdong region, which is what was known in the West as Canton, is today one of the most advanced industrial and prosperous parts of the world and continues to boom, a tribute to the very civilized and progressive national economic policies followed by successive Chinese governments over the past 45 years. So the wheel comes full circle, but it only starts to roll under Palmerston. So what have we seen so far? In his eminent career, Palmerston has raped and annihilated the civilizations of Spanish Central and South America. Then he ravaged Russia. Then he crushed the Mughal civilization in India and killed 1 million more Indians and enslaved more than 200 million more Indians in addition to that. And now he has carried out the greatest war crime on the largest scale of all. He has enslaved China and he has smashed the civilization of China and he has thrown China into what is known as the Dark Century, the century of oppression. When for 100 years Chinese were banned when dogs were allowed in the parks of their own major cities by the dominant Western imperial powers. That is how horrific it was for 100 years up to 1948. And even then, you have a horrible time of famines and catastrophic policies under Mao for the next 28 years afterwards, until the clouds finally clear, which they did. But it is known as the century of powerlessness, it is the dark century, and it is Palmerston's creation personally from the beginning to the end. Palmerston's policy of unleashing the unlimited drug war and drug trade on China is so monstrous and outrageous that it even outrages the chief financial beneficiary of the slave trade in the world, his own finance minister and future Prime Minister of Britain, William Ewart Gladstone. Gladstone is the architect of the free market liberal policies that not only have dominated Britain to this day, but that were taken over in President Reagan's time into the Republican Party as well. Open borders, protectionism, allow industry to wither on the vine at home, allow hundreds of thousands of agricultural and industrial workers at home to starve. You can always bring in cheap, free food to keep them quiet. And you actually use the profits that you're making shamelessly to invest in the third world and enslave entire new populations and new markets. This is real liberalism. It goes back to Gladstone, goes back to Palmerston, right? But even Gladstone has reached his limit. The enslavement of the largest nation on earth and in human history to put them all, make them all opium drug addicts is too much even for Gladstone. Even though Gladstone is a billionaire by 21st century standards, and the Gladstone family fortune comes from profits in the slave trade. His father was the largest single slave owner in the world in the city of Liverpool in the first half of the 19th century. And who did the father fund and who was the father a close friend of? Why, of course, Lord Palmerston. Now, were Palmerston and Gladstone evil, racist fascists? No, of course not. They were both much too enlightened for that. They were the founders of the Liberal Party in 19th century England. Palmerston is the first Liberal Party official Prime Minister in 1859 when the party is constituted. And after he dies, Gladstone leads and dominates the party for the next 30 years till his own death, nearly 90 years old. Right? Now, in all these monstrous crimes, the British have a national partner. Who plays Tonto to the English Lone Ranger? France does. Yet, as I told you before, from 1670, Louis XIV, to the end of the Wars of Napoleon, France is the arch enemy of Britain, and the British are terrified of France. Even when the Bourbon kings briefly come back in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, they try to win the favor of the French people with a policy of popular nationalism as well as industrialization, and the British are terrified of it. In 1848, the British carry out, therefore, a classic color revolution in France. The relatively mild and tolerant and certainly economically progressive Louis Philippe, the last Bourbon monarch, is toppled, right? Rather like the way President Viktor Yushchenko is toppled in 2014 in the Maidan coup in Kiev. On both occasions, supposedly true democracy takes over. Freedom, liberalism, free trade, freedom of speech, at last. And yet, within a year, there is another Napoleon leading France. Now, he's actually not a descendant of the great Napoleon. He's an obscure, distant cousin who really isn't related at all, but through family tinkering, have been able to basically steal and appropriate the name Louis Napoleon. And he comes from Britain, where he has been sheltered and financed and stroked and praised and nurtured. And within a year, he is president of France. Surprise, surprise. And 2 years after that, he is emperor of France. Isn't it terrible? And he called him Emperor Napoleon III because Napoleon had a son who died young, was probably poisoned by the British the same way Napoleon himself was. But anyway, he's been gone for 20 years and he never had the chance to grow up. So forget the son, right? So you have Napoleon III, Emperor of France. And who destroyed the first French Empire? The great, mighty, fearsome British. So Napoleon III knows which side his croissant is buttered on. And he becomes a loyal ally, the most loyal ally of Britain for the next 20 years. His stated public policy towards the British Empire is to be the slave and running dog of Lord Palmerston. So when the British go to war against Russia and kill 1 million Russians in 1854 and 1855, this gentleman is there with them. Napoleon III is with the British as the loyal ally of the British. And when they smash the Chinese empire a second time and destroy the great summer palace in Beijing with its limitless treasures going back 1,500 years, French soldiers are there as the comrades in arms of the British barbarians who are smashing and literally annihilating French civilization. And back in 1858, when that gallant liberal Democrat and champion of freedom, Garibaldi, quote unquote, liberates southern Italy with the aid of the Camorra organized crime syndicates of Naples and the mafia organized crime and prostitution syndicates of Sicily. Why? The British don't have an army to actually smash the Austrian Empire, which is still capable of putting up a fight. It is the French who do their dirty work for them at the Battle of Solferino in 1859. Wherever you find the British, you find the French with them. And then we come to America, which arguably is Lord Palmerston's most ambitious project. For more than 30 years, Palmerston and the British deep state are working for the secession of the deep slave states from the United States to splinter America. And this is very explicitly understood and stated. Palmerston runs the British deep state effectively from 1808, when he's only 28 years old, when he becomes Secretary for War, to his death 57 years later in 1865, just 2 days short of his 81st birthday, from his 20s into his 80s. One man runs the British deep state around the world. global subversion and enslavement and manipulation and wars. One man runs them. And who is his successor? Why, a man who leads the British deep state into the 20th century and is virtually certainly a direct descendant of Queen Elizabeth I, Robert Gascoigne Cecil. Gascoyne. But he isn't as obscure as he sounds because, again, this wonderfully convenient British habit of completely changing your name when you become a lord or an aristocrat or this, that, or the other makes it much more difficult for foreigners to keep track of you, right? He is known to history as Lord Halifax. He is Foreign Secretary, of course, you know, backwards, of course. And Lord Halifax is Secretary for Foreign Affairs in the British Conservative government from 1874 to 1880. And he is Prime Minister and the dominant figure in Britain for nearly 20 years after that, for most of the period from 1884 to 1903. And after he retires, already into the 20th century, Lord Halifax openly says, what is the greatest mistake British statesmen made when they ruled the world through the 19th century? We did not splinter the United States when we had the chance to during the Civil War. He says this. Look it up. It's on the record. And of course, he hides in plain sight because everyone says, oh, he was just a great man in his dotage. He doesn't really mean a word of it. He meant every word of it, and he had the heart to enforce it because he followed in the footsteps of Palmerston. As I said, British policy in the 1830s to the 1860s is two-sided. They have abolished slavery because they don't need any more slaves themselves in the sugar plantations of the West Indies, which were the main currency earner for Britain. Remember, I said before they weren't interested in the Middle East because there was nothing to be gotten out of the Middle East. Nobody knew oil was there, and even if they did, the technology to use oil had not been dreamed of, let alone invented, up to and past Palmerston's death. Hadn't been invented. It begins and becomes important afterwards, but still nobody dreams there's anything significant in the Ottoman Empire. So, although a couple of romantic British twits will say, like George Eliot or Disraeli himself, will say, oh, how wonderful it would be if the Jews became modern Arabs and put on flowing Arab robes and established a wonderful Crusader kingdom in the Middle East, they don't actually do anything about it. What Disraeli does do is he takes the control of the Suez Canal because there's money to be made from it and it's the key communications route to India. And the British then, of course, routinely swallow up Egypt at a gulp from the French, their own ally, because they want to make sure they keep control of the routes to India, which they still regard. I mean, Britain is a tiny little country of 20 million people at the time. India already has 200 million people to 50 million people. If you can enslave them and use limitless numbers of them in your army, you can enslave Asia. And for 200 years they did, up to 1941, right? But that's all they want. They don't then move on to try and invade Palestine or Iraq or anything else. Who the fuck needs it, as they would say in my native Belfast? There's no money to be made from it. And by the 1840s and 50s, the money is going out of the sugar trade in the Caribbean as well. But there is money to be made in the Lancashire mills from cotton grown from the cotton trade in the United States, which are grown by slaves. So the British follow a double game. They boast about suppressing the slave trade, and at the same time they turn a blind eye to it because the slave trade expands and flourishes, and the greatest market for the selling of slaves in the world, and there's no secret about it, it's totally open at the time, is in the great port cities of Norfolk and Charlotte and Richmond in Virginia. Virginia is is where the slaves are sucked in, because the slave trade is growing apace. And also the growing of cotton exhausts the land, and the British and the Virginia slave owners alike are both incredibly greedy and short-sighted and unscientific. So they don't understand rotation of crops and they don't look into it. So they just exhaust the land. So while they're making monstrous profits, they're also exhausting the land. So the slave trade must expand west. It must keep expanding to keep the flow of cotton going to the Lancashire mills and the Lancashire mill owners. And that is why slavery is forced to expand and cannot simply be contained, as Jefferson, he may not have been serious about it, but as Jefferson originally wishfully claimed. But of course, Jefferson directly benefited from the slave trade too, and his incomes plummeted because he was a terrible farmer and landowner, and he exhausted his land as well. The replenishment of the land of the South only comes under a very different kind of Democrat. It comes under the New Deal of the great Franklin Roosevelt and the two great figures who are the driving forces for the scientific rotation of crops and replenishment of the soil that ends hundreds of years of destitution and slavery across the South and Southwest are Roosevelt himself, the greatest Secretary of Agriculture in American history, Henry Wallace, and of all people, a great reform farmer who wanted to be Secretary of Agriculture, but FDR had other plans for him, so made him Secretary of the Treasury instead, Henry Morgenthau Jr. Now, it's almost impossible to find anyone to like Henry Morgenthau Jr. because the guy had everything going against him. He was a New York banker. He was German. He was Jewish. He was wealthy. And worst of all, he was a lifelong closest friend of Franklin Roosevelt. They used to go riding together. In fact, Morgenthau's father was an eminent banker who became the US ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and being Jewish, was the only man to save the Armenian Christian peoples from genocide during World War I from the Ottoman Empire when America was still neutral. So the father was a great man too, but the father didn't approve of his son. Here is the father, a solid, respectable German Jewish banker on Wall Street, a respectable figure. My only son. How does he waste his time? This wastrel, this degenerate, this good for nothing? All he wants to do is grow apple trees and go riding on horses in his apple orchards with that equally useless, contemptible, no good, dissolute, he'll never come to anything friend of his, young Frank Roosevelt. Right? Isn't it wonderful the way even honorable, well-meaning people can be totally blind to what should be staring them in the face? Especially the good things. Being naive and innocent and blind to the bastards is one thing, but this is another. Now I apologize, wandered further afield again. We are back with Lord Palmerston. But Palmerston and his people are closely connected with the Knights of the Golden Circle, and they work closely with the Confederate States and their supporters in the Confederate States to trigger the Civil War. And once the Civil War begins, Palmerston's policy is very clear. He is seeking for an excuse to declare war on the Union and blockade the Union ports, which Britain, as the supreme naval power in the world, allied to France, can easily do. And he bribes the French to go along with him. How does he bribe Napoleon III? France will have its own empire in Mexico in the south. The Mexican people with serious democracy have abolished slavery, which outraged the Southern American states. That's why the Alamo was fought. The Alamo was defended by Texas slave owners, and Santa Anna's Mexican army represented a state and a nation and a national movement that had abolished slavery in Mexico. So, of course, it could not be allowed to contaminate good slave-owning Texas. Could not be allowed to do so, right? But those finicky Mexicans with absolutely no sense of class at all or aristocracy insist on appointing an Indian, a native, Benito Juarez as their first president. How dare they? So a financial crisis is artificially manufactured in London and Paris. Does this sound familiar? And Juarez is libelously slandered in the Times of London and the main great newspapers of Paris as a libertine, as an illiterate, as a savage, and worst of all, as a man who has driven his country into bankruptcy, just like those social democratic leaders across Latin America to this day. Is this starting to sound even more familiar? So, Britain and France, for the good of their investors, and of course for civilization as a whole and free trade, intervene to topple Juarez, and they do. And they talk a well-meaning, benign, a really genuinely kind but idiotic fool, Maximilian von Habsburg, the brother of the Emperor Franz Joseph, into becoming Emperor of Mexico. Now, here the plan begins to run a bit off the rails because the British and the French envisage Maximilian as, of course, a ludicrous figurehead, such as they have had in so many places, people like Zelensky, who will either rejoice in the crushing of the Mexican people or will not be too stupid to even realize it's going on. Well, Maximilian is an idiot, like all the Habsburgs, but he's not that much of an idiot, and he means well. He drafts a constitution. He explains that he is going to champion the rights of the native peoples of Mexico. But of course, he has no power to enforce his constitution. The French army is enforcing their idea of the rule of law, which is no law at all, instead backed by and protected by the Royal Navy. And even worse, Napoleon and Maximilian have not timed it well. When they plot the takeover of Mexico, they think the Confederacy is winning the Civil War because Robert E. Lee is smashing all the brave Union armies and killing hundreds of thousands of brave Union boys because Lincoln can only is appointing one hideous asshole after another as his generals. But then Lincoln finally wakes up and appoints a genuinely very good commander, who you will recall I've also given a previous seminar on here, and I believe you can access it on YouTube. Ulysses S. Grant, the most successful, experienced, impressive battle general and underestimated president in United States history. So by the time Maximilian is acclaimed in a fake ceremony as Emperor of Mexico in 1864, the Union has survived and is winning. And Grant has pinned Robert E. Lee and his armies down and inflicted major unsustainable casualties on them in the terrible battles of the Wilderness and through northern Virginia, and drives them back to the lines of St. Petersburg. So the Confederacy has nobody to help Maximilian and the French anymore. Now, Napoleon III, like all, maybe not all, but most blustering bullies, is a coward and runs for his life. Palmerston's policy has busted. And of course, Palmerston is certainly a sociopath and very, I would say, a psychopath too. We have a couple of more things to say on his private life, which are very revealing on that before we finish. But clearly, Maximilian is busted flush. Poor Maximilian is a fool. He had never been in Mexico in his life before. He is only quote unquote emperor for 2.5 years before he's captured and toppled. There are moves made to rescue him or to ransom him. Benito Juarez doesn't hate him personally, but Juarez is a great Mexican nationalist. He will not have his country raped endlessly. And the man who was stupid enough and morally blind enough to allow himself to be the figurehead for the invasion and conquest and rape of Mexico must not be allowed to go free. So only less than 3 years after he was proclaimed emperor, Maximilian is hauled up before a firing squad and shot dead. To the last second, the idiot claims, "My beloved people will never pull the trigger. They will never shoot me." Famous last words indeed. And that is how Abraham Lincoln and Benito Juarez and Ulysses S. Grant dealt with this great smashing attempt to break the Monroe Doctrine and create a new neo-British and French empire across the world. Now, we come back full circle. Palmerston is 81 years old, and he is relaxing in the way always most convivial to him. He is raping a teenage servant girl on a billiards table at an aristocratic weekend, and finally has a stroke. But he goes out the way he came in, because there is certainly an outrageous style to the bastard, and his last recorded words, which appear to be true, are when he's told that the stroke is mortal and he'll be dead in an hour or two. His last recorded words are, "Die, that's the last thing I shall do." Yeah, once I let that sink in. Exactly. Now, he was, of course, an Irish peer, which brings in paradoxes as well, because he's not Irish at all. He's an English aristocrat of multiple generations who have enslaved the Irish. And he even has a role in the Irish famine of 1845 to 1848. because his personal vast wealth is based on estates in Ireland, in working the peasants to the bone. And he recognizes Ireland is enormously overpopulated, and with the failure of the potato famine, people cannot be fed. So what's his solutions? He has two solutions. First, he takes the squatters who have traditionally lived on his land and grown their own potatoes there and can't even grow potatoes to pay their rent anymore. And he simply kicks them out to die of starvation in the gutter and of typhus, which they do. But he has a more constructive policy as well. We should depopulate Ireland by encouraging them to go to America. So he actually pays for about 2,000 to 4,000 of his tenants to go on ships to America. They are called the death ships. Most of those he sends die on them. They are not steamships. Steamship technology is still in its early stages and has not yet expanded to the mass carrying of hundreds of thousands of passengers or immigrants a year to the New World or back, as will happen within the next 20 to 25 years. It takes 3 or 4 months on a sailing ship to get to America, and you are on a sailing ship, so you are hit by bad storms. 2 million starving Irish people go on those ships. They are known in Irish, most of them in the year 1847. To this day, known throughout Ireland as Black 47. Right. 2 million people go to America on those ships. It takes 2 months to get there. 500,000 never make it. They die on the ships from seasickness and typhus and famine and related diseases and exhaustion. So they have to be thrown overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. So the fisheries boom because the fish can feed on the rotting bodies for many years to come, and the fish population dramatically expands. Black 47, and this is Lord Palmerston's solution to the overpopulation of Ireland. It's a very small, though monstrous crime compared with the annihilation of civilization in China, the extermination of entire societies all the length of South America. To this day, anthropologists are still discovering the remains of peoples in Patagonia, in southern Argentina, that they never knew existed, who were exterminated by British and Argentinian adventurers in the years of Palmerston. And this man ruled the world. The world was the most powerful man in the world one of the most powerful men in the world from 1808 to 1855, and then without question was the most powerful in the world from 1855 to 1865, and he died raping a terrified teenage girl. If we were addressing the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which of course is a joke, I would simply say the prosecution rests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. That was tremendous.
Wow. Wow, Marty. That was quite a tour de force. If anybody has any questions for Marty, please
Go ahead.
raise your hand.
The afternoon is young.
Yes, hand or write your name in the chat box. Whew, okay, I don't even know where to start here. Okay, I had myself a question regarding, because I'm doing a little bit of a dive into this whole idea of Anglo-Saxonism, okay? And this whole myth of the Anglo-Saxon Teutonic myth. So I wanted to see what you had to say about that in regards to Palmerston.
Well, Palmerston was a more casual racist. And the very fact of racism, again, you make a key point here, because Hitler is very open about this. Hitler admired the British Empire. And in all his monstrous crimes across Europe, especially the plans to annihilate the Russian and Ukrainian peoples, and enslave and virtually exterminate the Polish peoples, and we know what he was planning to do to the Jewish people as well, he's very open. Germany leads Lebensraum to the east. Look what the British did in North America and Australia. And for that matter, in Africa. In Africa, they didn't actually depopulate. There were too many people to do so. But they did practice genocide in southern Africa. Now, in southern Africa, the real enslavement comes after Palmerston dies. And again, technology is crucial to this because first railroads have to be developed to penetrate into the rich farmlands as far north as the Zambezi River. And secondly, when it comes to West Africa and tropical Africa, malaria is the great killer for Westerners. You have it in the Southern American states too, but it is especially lethal along with yellow fever in tropical Africa. And the medical technology the medical know-how to begin to protect white settlers or white military forces from this only starts to come in following the great achievements of Pasteur and others in the 1870s and early 1880s. And then, of course, it's only after this that you can have the genocide starting in 1886 or so, under Lord Salisbury's approval, of course, in what is now Congo, which is then run by Belgium with the full financing and support of the City of London as well behind it. But this comes later. So we see again here, in Palmerston's case, is he a casual racist? Yes, he is. Does he believe in the superiority of his race, quote unquote? Yes, he does. But he's pre-Darwin. He's casual about it. And again, Magdalene, you've hit a key nail here. Because one of my favorite science fiction shows, in fact, drama shows of all time, is called Babylon 5. It ran 30 years ago. And for those of you who haven't watched it, chase it up immediately as soon as you go offline here, or make a note now, or even start pressing the buttons while you're still listening to me. If any of you are still conscious enough after me going on for so long to listen to me. But Babylon 5 is about a space station, and virtually all its episodes were written by its creator, a genius happily still with us called Joe Straczynski. He goes by the formal writing title of J. Michael Straczynski. Improbably enough, he made a good living for very many years in television before that as a scriptwriter and producer for Angela Lansbury on Murder, She Wrote. But once he got the chance on Babylon 5, he really cut loose. And one of the many plots in Babylon 5 is there is a race rather like the British Empire or the Nazis called the Centauri, a close world to Earth called Alpha Centauri. And they were a world of traders, and they were a world of much more ancient than Earth is, than humans are. But they have enslaved another race close by them called the Narn, N-A-R-N. And Narn was a garden world, and the Narn people were tall, proud, dignified, admirable. And they are slaughtered and tortured and broken under the most hideous circumstances by the Centauri. And there is at one point, this terrible crime is being discussed by two of the other characters in the most important place on the space station of Babylon 5, which is the bar where all the different races drink alcohol together, right? And Ambassador Jakar of the Narn is asked by his Earth friend from the Earth Alliance, but why did they do this? The Centauri are an ancient, civilized, cultured, otherwise admirable people. Why did they do these terrible things to your race, to your people, to the Narns, when you had done no harm to them? And Ambassador Jakar replies, I have often pondered on this, and I have come to the conclusion that there is one simple, clear answer. They inflicted these hellish tortures upon us because they could. There was no one to stop them. Because they can. And to my mind, that is the most terrifying line I have ever read in any work of either serious or popular fiction in my life. Because it is so insightful and it is so true, and think on the implications. This is a universal problem with the human race, and it is not even a problem limited to the human race. If we were to expand into space and meet an infinity of other races, there, as the Babylon 5 theme projects, and as the infinity of worlds that we now know exist, strongly suggests and militates for, This is what we will find. We will find good guys and we will find very bad guys. We will find every kind of guy and girl and multitude of genders that we cannot conceive of, or this, that, and the other. If there is an infinity out there, then all things are possible. The only thing that stops it being possible is generating morality and the power to defend that morality and the power to enforce the strength of that morality, which brings us back to the necessity of the nation state and why the liberal vision of open borders, peace for everybody, is not that way. When my old teacher was right, freedom for the large predator fish, the pike, the Palmerston, you could say, is very different from freedom for the sardine, which the rest of us are.
Yeah.
But that's a crucial question, and it's a wonderful question, Magdalena. But there's your answer. Of course, he's a racist. But why is he a racist? All the supposedly sophisticated theories of Darwin and Stuart Chamberlain and the rest of them, all this shit hasn't been developed yet. He's a racist because he can be. Because he thinks he's at the top of, and that's why his successors in Britain, and he himself, no doubt, because he had 6 years to hear of Darwin and read it after the Origin of the Species came out. It gives them a perfect justification to go on enslaving the rest of the universe forever.
Mm.
We do it because we're there. We do it because we can.
Thanks, Marty. Jerry has a question, and then I have Stephen Doyle after that. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Jerry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Thanks, Marty. That was a great presentation. And I like the way at the very end you brought in the Irish and what Palmerston did to the Irish, because and that I had this thought, I've had it for a while, because as you know, lately, President Trump made a little joke about Canada becoming the 51st state. And the next thing you know, our prime minister resigns. We just got a new one, this bankster, and we're probably going to have an election. So my question to you is, do you think we can get Trump to propose that Ireland becomes the 52nd state?
Oh, Jerry, don't give him that idea. He take it seriously. Look, I may have told the story before. Back in 1991, I was still permitted to write for the National Review, the conservative journal in Washington. And I suggested to John O'Sullivan, a previous senior political advisor to Margaret Thatcher, who ran it at the time, I had a wonderful idea, I thought, for an April's Day Fool article. Because it must have been after 93, because the X-Files were already on, and I had the idea for it, right? I said, let's have an article based on an X-Files plot. Why are Vietnam War veterans disappearing all across America? They're being kidnapped by the Pentagon or the CIA or the Men in Black to be killed and dismembered so that their body parts can be sent back to Vietnam to be recycled as MIA remains that the Vietnamese have found, because this was the issue holding up trade relations with Vietnam at the time. Now, I meant this to be a typical black humor, Northern Ireland black joke, right? But John was more sensible than me. He was horrified. He said, my dear boy, we couldn't possibly write that. Our readers would believe it. And that's why what you have just said, Jerry, bless you, is so dangerous. If the president gets the idea, he'll do it. He's perfectly capable of doing it. You see, you don't realize your power. You're always way ahead of the rest of us. And it's wonderful, but it can also be terrifying, you know?
That's exactly what I said to him.
Yes, exactly. You understand.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Marty, for hammering that down.
Well, no, I mean, I ran away from it in terror. Jerry was entirely too on the ball, you know? He doesn't realize his power.
Stephen, what do you have to say?
Hi, Marty. Thanks very much for a great lecture. It was off camera because while I'm listening to you, I'm making corned beef and cabbage, obviously, St. Patrick's Day coming up.
How quickly can I fly to you, man?
There's a bit of the Doyle family lore. My great grandfather, Mickey Doyle, made his own gin, but the only day of the year he would not drink is St. Patrick's Day because that was for amateurs.
Yes, that's wonderful.
Okay, my question is a bit tangential to your lecture, but with all the stuff that Matt and Cynthia and others have been digging up in terms of the role that the occult and or Satanism plays in the contemporary evil, and seeing how Palmerston leads into that, I was wondering if there's any evidence or suspicion that Palmerston was into that dark side of spirituality, for lack of a better term, or was he just a nasty person at core without any occult dimension to him?
Up to now, I've assumed the latter, but again, you should look into it, and so should I and Jerry, and maybe everybody else here too, because I just haven't looked into it. Until you raised it, Stephen, it's so obvious, but it never occurred to me. Now, I've not seen it. I've not seen a hint of it. But look at his face. It is an ape's face. The irony is here is Darwin, who says man rose from the apes, right?
Yep.
And you look at the photographs of Palmerston, not prettied up the way the portraits painted of him are, and you see the face of a beast. Now, he was capable of hiding this, like Andrew Jackson. He loved to play the gallant. He had a mistress with whom he probably had several of his children. Emily Lamb, she was actually the wife, one of these hell for leather girls who likes to be outrageous. And they were very happy together. But even while they were very happy together, he was still raping servant girls, because that's what you did, and it was the accomplished thing to do. A personal recollection on this, more than 40 years ago, I was a guest at a country house weekend thrown by a major shareholder in the Times of London, very wealthy man. And I found myself at the table sitting with a very beautiful, attractive young English lady beside him, no, beside me. And although she was very perfectly friendly and charming to me, I had difficulty talking to her because I was afraid I would say the wrong thing, because it was not clear to me whether she was the wife of my host and friend, whether she was one of his ex-wives, whether she was one of his current mistresses, or a past mistress, or one of his illegitimate daughters. She could have been any of those things. And I was simply too simple and unsophisticated and, uneducated in the ways of the gossip of that particular set. To this day, I don't know which she was, right? But this is the kind of circle in which Palmerston operated. So it would be very worthwhile looking into this, because he has the psychological profile. It's exactly the kind of thing he would have done. And the Hellfire Club is very well documented in the 18th century. Occultism becomes enormously, as you know, well documented through Blavatsky and her friends in the later 19th century on both sides of the Atlantic. The English upper class always seems to have a more than average obsession with these things. And if you look at what Palmerston does, as I said before, it is Darwinism made manifest, but he does not get it from the thought of Darwin. The thought of Darwin is actually an outgrowth of the way the English ruling class, and the working class too, see society. They see the world as literally their oyster, or rather the world as their virgin to be repeatedly raped. And this is very explicit. It is very explicit. It begins to change with the upper class. A veneer, at least, of civilization and hypocrisy, and sometimes more than that, comes in with the English public school system, when it stops being absolutely chaotic and savage, and it starts inculcating what they imagine to be Roman and Greek and Christian values. But this only really starts in the 1860s and becomes manifest around 1870. There's an excellent book that documents this called The Collapse of British Power by the great British historian, who incidentally was Margaret Thatcher's favourite historian. She put him in the House of Lords, Corelli Barnett, Corellibarnett, The Collapse of British Power. So no, I have absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Palmerston was involved in any of this. But that may mean nothing because I never thought to look. I never thought, and I think you again, bless you, have asked a frightened. You've done it again. You and Jerry are always doing this to me. I always think, oh my God, why didn't I see these things when they were staring me in the face 30 and 40 years ago? And it's perfectly obvious to you. So it's a hugely important question, and it'd be very interesting for any of us here to look, anyone here to look into it and to hear what anybody finds. Because, like I say, I have no evidence for it whatsoever. One, but two, I haven't looked. Three, I never even dreamed of it. And four, if you look at the kind of man he was, it would be totally consistent.
Thanks, Marty.
Thanks, Marty. I think Peter had a question. I believe it's Peter. Direct.
Yeah, here I am, Martin. Here
Okay,
I am.
it is you.
Of course.
Go for it, Peter.
Go, man.
Okay, I've got a narrower question that goes back to his Palmerston's early career in the deep state, and it does involve some of my ancestors. We're going back to 1821 with the Greek War of Independence through 1829, and the question is, what did Palmerston do to keep the Greeks and the Ottomans fighting against each other? Because there were a lot of nationalist Greek leaders in the War of Independence, including an ancestor of mine. And to this day, they've been plagued by fighting between nationalists and fighting against the pro-monarchists and the groups of people who wanted to curry favor with the empire. By the way, happy Purim, Martin.
Happy St. Patrick's Day to you as well.
You got it.
Can we kill two birds with one stone?
That's right. In St. Paul, where it's the third most Irish city per capita in the United States, if a kid didn't cut school for the St. Patrick's Day parade, there was something wrong with him.
That's wonderful. I didn't know that. New York and Boston are obvious, but I would have said Philly would have been, number 3 or number 4. So go figure. Anyhow, again, no direct answer, but and again, a hugely important question. And again, historical parallels are revealing. Look at what has happened in Ukraine in the last 10 years. We have flooded Ukraine with US government advisors, with so-called free individuals, many of them genuinely self-motivated idiots who believe what they're told to believe about spreading democracy and instant happiness, this, that, and the other. And both organized and disorganized. We flood the country in advance with our own activists until and if nobody wants to start a revolution, we'll stir it up ourselves. And this appears to have happened in Greece. There are two other factors from the British perspective. The British fall in. Remember, nobody knew anything about Ukraine or gave a damn till the Maidan coup. And all of a sudden, there are Ukrainian flags, and every Republican and Democrat in the House and the Senate is sporting little Ukrainian flags. And are they really lovers of the Ukrainian people? Of course they aren't. They are sending 1 million Ukrainian boys to their death under an enslaved regime, which continues to enslave them to this day. It's all a sick joke. And there was a lot of element of this to the Greeks as well. The British had just won the Napoleonic Wars. They had naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. They could do anything they wanted, and they were in love with the idea of the classical world, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And for the first time, they were like the Americans in the 20th century. They were infant children with the power of gods, and they could make their most infantile dreams come true. So Lord Byron goes to Greece. The great poetic poet of the time, the Norman Mailer of the time, right? Or the Maya Angelou of the time in England, who wrote equally execrably bad poetry and fiction, right? And they are worshipped. And Byron gets himself drowned, I think it was, or dies of a fever, I forget which, while he's in Greece. So, of course, he has to become a martyr to the cause. And what finally establishes Greek victory? Why, something very familiar. An Anglo-French naval victory over the outclassed Ottoman fleet at a sea battle in 1827. In other words, ultimately, Greece becomes free not because the people want it, whether they do or not, or not because the people are militarily able to defeat the ruthless and merciless and very efficient when they turn their minds to it Ottoman Turkish army. It is again at the supremacy of Western firepower that creates the outcome. And then the history before that is retroactively written to make it sound like it was a triumph of the people. And really, for the next 100 years plus, Greece, uh, the independent country of Greece, is basically run not even as a colony, because then it would be run more rationally and probably more generously, but as a toy of the British. It's run as a toy of the British for the next 100 years. So it's a very relevant question. And again, it comes back to the same period of time when Palmerston, like the neocons today, is a jumped up little shit with the power of gods, who not only thinks he can do everything, he thinks he will do everything. And in his own lifetime, he's able to. I should have added that in his last years, he finally comes up against limits. He comes up against three limits. He comes up against Abraham Lincoln and industrializing America. He comes up against Otto von Bismarck and industrializing Prussia, which will become modern Germany. And he comes up against the great Tsar Alexander the Great, protector of Lincoln, friend of Lincoln, protector of the Union, liberator of the serfs of Russia, and champion of the freeing of the black slaves of America in Russia. And they are industrializing their nations. And in the years before he dies, Palmerston is not able to block them. And Bismarck humiliates Palmerston. I think the remark may have been made after Palmerston's death, or it may have been made before. It's worth checking up, and my memory does not. In fact, one can even look it up now. But at one point, Palmerston is asked. I know either Palmerston, one of his Bismarck is asked, "What if? How can you go defying Lord Palmerston like this on the Schleswig-Holstein question, on whether two duchies should be part of Denmark or part of Germany and part of Prussia?" And Bismarck is defying Britain, the supreme power in the world, and Prussia still seems to be a quite small German state at the time. What will you do if the British army lands in North Germany to stop you? And Bismarck replies to the Reichstag, to the Prussian Parliament, "If the British army lands in North Germany, I'll send the police to arrest them." In other words, the British may be supreme at sea, but on land they're wimps and they don't have the firepower, and we can call their bluff. And that is a crucial moment in the history of Eurasia when British power is first stopped in its tracks. When Bismarck says, if they send an army to North Germany, I'll send the police to arrest them. And this bursts Palmerston's bubble. He may even have been dead already when it was said. I have to look up the exact chronology. But it is a crucial turning point, and it ends the unconditional rape of the world by the British in the name of Palmerston.
Wow.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay. Jerry has a follow-up, I think, on the
Sure.
occultism of Palmerston. And then there is Pete M, who also had a question or a comment. Okay, so Jerry first.
Yes. Stephen, you got me thinking, and I had to run back into my notes to find it. I had done some research last year on another horrible little man, John Ruskin.
Yes,
And
yes.
I don't know if Palmerston was into all occultism, but his stepson and his stepson's wife were. And in fact, Palmerston dies 1865, and the very next year, 1866, I read this book on how Palmerston's stepson and his wife held these seances, and their very good friend Ruskin used to come and sit in on these things. So they were into this spiritualism and theosophy and everything. That was a year after Palmerston's died. I can't put the finger on Palmerston himself, but his stepson was certainly into it. In fact, 1875, Ruskin moves into Palmerston's house so he can have access to his library. So anyway, Marty, that's what I have, but I'm sure there's a Palmerston connection in there somewhere. I don't have it, but that much I know.
Look how fast this is moving, Jerry. Stephen asks this marvelous question. Never occurred to me before at all. Should have been so obvious. Stephen and I discuss it. You're already advancing and nailing the subject and pointing where people can look for further research on it. That's an enormously important connection you've made.
So let's see if Pete has something to add to this.
Yeah.
Pete?
Hi, Martin. Thanks for the very enlightening lecture. I really enjoyed it. But as far as maybe like an indirect link that occurs to me between Palmerston and the occult is his effect, like you were saying in the Taiping Revolution, how you have these this kind of prophecy, and this person claiming to be Jesus's brother, but also in the French Revolution, which you tied with Palmerston. And I know that there's a lot of links to the occult there, like for instance in the work Des Enfants de l'Ancien Régime, and there's a lot of discussion about the Chevalier de la Manchette. There's a lot of these kind of like occult pseudo-Christian orders leading up to the French Revolution. So, I mean, again, it's kind of indirect, but if he had an effect on these movements, then maybe there's actually a link there as well.
Again, I'd be very interested in what you, along with Jerry and Stephen, dig out on this. I agree, Pete. I know nothing about the subjects, but here's the point: these subjects are in terms of liberal secular historiography. The response is like talking about UFOs. Everybody just gives us a superior smile and a sneer, and the very fact that anybody raises anything as a possibility automatically means you and I and the rest of it were all crackpots. And it's the ignoramuses who rule the roost. Of course, the truth is the opposite. If you're living in an infinite universe, you don't know what is and what may be and what is not unless you look into it. And if any of if these things exist, and certainly the Hellfire Club and outfits like that certainly existed, uh, the greatest protection they have is people simply assuming, as a matter of ironic faith, even though they're not. It's always the non-Christians and the non-believers, the non-Muslims, the non-traditionalists who are most likely to disbelieve what's staring them in the face. On a secular level, one thing I've noticed over here, and I don't know if you've noticed this too, but I've seen it all my life. You ask a Republican conservative in America if President Kennedy could have been assassinated as just part of any kind of wider conspiracy. Any kind of, whether it was the mob or the Russians or the Cubans or this, that, and the other, whatever, right? Or the FBI, anyone, right? The CIA, whatever. Republicans will say, almost certainly, of course he was, even if we don't know the details. But you ask any liberal Democrat who claim to worship at the feet of JFK, and not a single one of them will believe it. Every one of them believes in the Lee Harvey Oswald absurdity that he did it by himself. None of them have ever looked into anything. None of them have asked any awkward questions, let alone received any answers or not received any answers. But the very people who you think should be the most open to this, since it was the great liberal hero who was assassinated, they're the ones who swallow the Kool-Aid. And this to me is fascinating. I don't know what it says about the nature of belief and stupidity and what have you, but it certainly says something, you know? And again, when we're looking into this kind of thing that you've raised as well, I don't have any answers. But I think you've asked very important questions.
Thank you. Maybe it's willful ignorance,
Yeah.
by the Democrats.
So I have nobody else, I think. Oh, wait, Stephen Doyle, you had something about Quigley.
Just one last thought, Marty. I
Yes.
mean, I know we tend to think of Carroll Quigley in terms of tragedy and hope and the Anglo-American establishment and all those revelations, but his The Evolution of Civilizations, the book on historical analysis, I find is brilliant. And when you look at it, I think it was his sixfold division of culture. Religion was one of the prime things in there. So I think in terms of historical rigor and having defensible arguments, if we say that there's some sort of hidden controlling entity, it would be a subculture and it would have a religious dimension to its own subculture, which would be occult and Satanism and all that sort of stuff. And I think you could also tie that into Lash's The Culture of Narcissism and this hidden controlling subculture. I think you'd also make an argument that this is the splitting of the ego at the collective level. So, I'm doing my very pale imitation of importing psychoanalysis and trying to personify the broader system and apply some of those principles. But I think there's some interesting theoretical avenues you could look at as well.
Yes, no, I'm not an expert on this. You're way ahead of me in that level, so I have nothing constructive to add except to say I think you're right. I think doing the kind of meta-historical analysis, looking at psychological frameworks and frameworks of belief systems, and what we already know. I mean, we still are old-fashioned enough to get cable here, and I am old-fashioned enough to actually like it. And on channels like Discovery and the History Channel and what have you, they're always going on about the Knights Templars or Bigfoot or this, that, or the other. And most of it is unprovable, and a lot of it may or may not be nonsense. And with UFOs, there's every kind of speculation and the like out there. But you can see that just as the concept of belief systems as frameworks to organize the way the way all of us see and do not see the world. This is enormously important. I tend to look at it in a more, it's not to say you're all, on the contrary, I think you're pointing out wider pictures of great significance here. But one thing that fascinates me is the people, and George Orwell sees this. You look at the people who will read the New York Times and watch PBS and CNN, and their minds are closed to every possibility. Their minds are totally closed. You can sell anything to them. You can tell them if Einstein said Niagara flowed backwards uphill, they'd believe it. They'd believe it. I'm not an Einstein fan, incidentally, far from it. But the point is, if you put things, they believe that we are defending democracy in Ukraine when we overthrew democracy in Ukraine in 2014. They believe the nation state is Nazi when the nation state is the greatest defense against Nazism. They believe the way to peace is a universal liberal state. And there are wonderful works of serious mainstream conventional history that blow this apart. In particular, I'd add The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers by Professor Paul Kennedy, which came out more than 30 years ago. And I remember when Professor Kennedy's book came out, the neocons hated it, screamed abuse at him. I'm amazed he wasn't lynched on the street and, God forbid, burned alive. And I've talked with him. He's a gentleman. He's a great guy. And he's going on producing regular. He's not a conspiracy theorist of any kind. But what did he say? He said, if you look at the rise and fall of the Spanish Empire, rise and fall of the French Empire, rise and fall of the British Empire, and what's happening now to America, they follow the same or similar broad historical patterns. Now, why should that outrage the true believers so much? Well, I think it's very simple, because the people who are at the top always want to believe that what Charles Krauthammer called the unipolar moment will last forever. That history has been. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a very sinister man and a very inept man. But he liked me in my early years in Washington and showed me great favor because he hated Russians like poison. And I was reporting that the Soviet Union was going downhill. Now, I was very anti-communist and still am, but I was not anti-Russian. But he being Polish and from a minor Polish aristocratic background and that, could never make the distinction, right? So in those days, I was in his good books. I didn't stay there, of course, but I was then. And I was deputed by the Washington Times in 1993 when Fukuyama came out with his ridiculous thesis of the end of history. right? To ask Brzezinski, the great mind, the great genius, what he thought about it. Now, Spig wasn't a great mind or a great genius, but he had a great sense of presence. He would have made a great Shakespearean actor. He would have been a star at Stratford if he'd stayed in Canada, you know? And I'm asking him this question on the phone. But please, Dr. Brzezinski, I know you've written on Dr. Fukuyama's book, The End of History. What's your assessment of it? Right? He replied to me, and again, he knew how to deliver a punchline. Will Martin, deep voice, pacing it, deep breath, pacing the boards in Stratford, Ontario again, right? Will Martin, after the end of history comes. Dramatic pause. Beat. 1, 2, 3. Punchline. More history. Exactly. So, whatever else you say about Spig, he could tell a joke. About Kissinger, a very dark figure, but Hitler had no sense of humor beyond abuse. Stalin, unfortunately, had a great sense of humor. Stalin's jokes are very funny. They always end with people getting killed in real life, but he really had wit. He really had wit, and Spig certainly had wit. Spig certainly had wit. More history. So that's what we're stuck with. More history.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Monty, you have your hand up. You have something to contribute? You have your mute on.
Oh, I see, yes.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. Thank you very much again, Marty. I appreciate that. You struck a couple notes with me, and one of them was in this search for the occult with Lord Palmerston. Might be worth viewing one particular avenue. I'm not sure when this thing initially arose, was actually popularized, but I was being recruited into some kind of a Freemasonic network at one point, and I was took aside, and I still have it. It's a map that shows the whole history of the bloodline, supposedly. It was called The History of the Anglo-Saxon Race. And it basically traced all the way from Jesus, all the way down through the present British monarchy. Insofar as basically their infatuation with the belief system that inherent in the British monarchy. Now, this might go something to the whole thing about the king being head of the church too in England, so far as that perception. But it might be an avenue worth researching that, because it might not be just, they're into voodoo and spiritualism so much. It might be a more subtle thing underneath where this belief system has evolved over the years with them.
Again, you open up other hugely important avenues here, and I agree with you, because I come from Northern Ireland. And British Israelism was still big in Northern Ireland when I was growing up. I know individuals who have been of political significance in the Protestant community in our generation who believed it implicitly. And there was an entire American fundamentalist movement that had huge impact in America and significant impact in Britain too, that preached the British and the Americans were the lost tribes of Israel. Now, it's bullshit. There is no evidence for it whatsoever. There never was, but we actually have the scientific proof that there is no evidence whatsoever, because there's no hint of this in DNA tracers anywhere. And incidentally, lost tribes of the Jewish people have been found, or genetic traces have been found among the Lemba people of southern Africa, and most of all among Osama bin Laden's tribes of people in Afghanistan, who have been devout Muslims for the last 1,000 to 1,200 years or so. But as far as this goes, there's this whole fake scholarship thing that is pure fantasy, that Jacob's pillow stone became the stone of Scone, or is standing up in the site of the kings of Tara in Ireland, or King David or his kids or Jeremiah brought Jewish princesses to Ireland. Now, this is pure fictional nonsense. It's all written out of a clear blue sky in the late 19th century. But it has an impact on the real world. Archaeologists in Ireland are still furious because the most important archaeological site of Iron Age Ireland, the site of the High Kings at Tara, was torn up by British Israelite maniacs 120 years ago at the beginning of the 20th century. And they were looking for the lost 10 tribes. They were looking for the Ark of the Covenant. God knows what else they were looking for. And in their imagination, they probably found it. But all they actually did was destroy the genuine archaeology of one of the most important sites in Ireland. And the reaction against this actually helped provoke the Irish national movement. So this is different from the occultism thing, but as you said, you can have both these things overlapping with each other, and while being totally different and even contradictory, they overlap with each other. They can reinforce each other in very garbled ways. I mean, look, we know the Nazis were looking for the Ark of the Covenant. Steven Spielberg's fun movie is based on the fact that Heinrich Hitler was not only a mass murderer, but also a raving idiot and maniac, and used the scarce resources of a major industrial economy to send expeditions from Tibet to Antarctica to Algeria, to look for the Knights Templar or, great wisdom leaders from space or this, that, and the other. There's a friend of mine, a Nobel Prize winner for peace, Dr. Helen Caldicott, and Australia, and she says, it's a very profound thought. She says the fact that a belief system is nonsense does not mean that the impact it has on the real world is not real. People are often motivated by delusional nonsense, and the very fact that it's non-existent in reality is not a reason to ignore it or underestimate it. So again, I think you're pointing us in very important and positive directions.
Okay, and I have Peter, you have something to say about Minnesota?
Yeah, Martin, I'm following up on your observation that nominal liberals will, almost to a person, reject any theory of JFK's assassination other than the solo job by Lee Harvey Oswald. And being one who lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, and who campaigned very heartily for Paul Wellstone of blessed memory in 1990, I can tell you the same phenomenon exists. There are very, very few people who will accept that he was assassinated in 2002, when objective evidence would point to something other than pilot error or icing. There was no ice there. And I can tell you that 6 minutes after the plane was reported missing, John King of CNN reported on CNN that President Bush, the younger, confirmed that Paul Wellstone was on that plane.
Yeah. I personally, I agree with you 100%. I'm not into the subject. I'm not an expert on it, but I've long had that sense. And Richard Cheney was running the secret state at that time, and he had a free hand over it. With there is this myth that you see in the movie, in a ridiculous TV fairy tale, The West Wing, that to be president of the United States, you have to be smarter and more virtuous and more dynamic and braver and more admirable than anyone else. The opposite is the case. Look at no wonder they hate President Trump so, because he tries to be forceful. Look at Obama. Look at Biden. Look at Bush Jr. This is the kind of people they run to run the United States. Idiots, corrupt fools, non-entities who you can pull the strings of and push around. Sometimes the most effective leaders are people like Reagan and Eisenhower, precisely because they are effective and serious, but they're very good at hiding the fact that they are effective and serious. They have to appear to be harmless, not just to the public, but to the people they're dealing with on a daily basis. That's important for survivability. Poor President Kennedy was obviously brilliant, obviously courageous, obviously principled and determined to do honorable things. So what chance could he have?
Thank you.
Same with so.
Do you have a follow-up, Peter? No. Okay. Thank you. I have one more question here, and that's Richard.
Yes.
Okay.
I just wondered, who would you say picked up the baton of imperialism after Palmerston?
Oh, very clearly. Excellent question, very clearly defined. And look, this is great detail. Lord Salisbury, Robert Gascoigne Cecil.
Thank you.
Without question. He is the true heir of the secret state. And it's interesting, he's already the heir apparent when he's Disraeli's foreign secretary. And Disraeli is the guy who, it's very important at the Congress of Berlin, Disraeli is not following a Zionist agenda. He is following a Turkish Ottoman agenda on behalf of the British Empire to keep Tsar Alexander has just won another great victory. He's liberated the Balkans from Muslim control and from Turkish control. He must not be allowed to do that. The Christians must be re-enslaved by the Turks. And so they are. And Disraeli carries this out, and he pulls it off and forces the Russians back in the negotiations in Berlin, at the Congress of Berlin. But the man he has beside him is the man who will succeed. Disraeli is very old. He's in his mid-70s already. He's in poor health. A couple of years later, he dies of natural causes. There's no serious debate about this. At least I don't think there is, though the timing is suggestive, because he dies just before, I think, the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And there is no question, and I've written on this, and you'll find I've done lectures for RTF on this that I think are still on YouTube. If you look at the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901, and you look at the assassination in 1881, 20 years earlier, of Tsar Alexander II, there was the same key figure behind it and the same methodology identically is used. The same mastermind is Peter Kropotkin, head of the anarchists, which is effectively Assassination International. And yet they never assassinate any British figures at all, or never attempt to. And they are protected in Britain. Kropotkin lives all his life until he goes back to Russia in 1917. 1918, he lives all his life in prosperity and security in London. And to this day, British historians and historiographers, and certainly in his own lifetime, worship him as a sweet, gentle, kindly figure. But the same methodology is used to an extraordinary degree in both these terrible assassinations. Kropotkin personally seduces a rather ugly, stupid young woman who becomes a fanatical hater of the President of the United States, Emma Lazarus, in the case of President McKinley, or Sophia, what's her name, in the case of Tsar Alexander II. They both lead tightly organized and controlled anarchist cells, and in both cases they get some foolish Polish illiterate to actually do the dirty deed and shoot the gun or throw the shrapnel grenade. It's identical even down to the use of a Polish dupe who was seduced previously by the girl who had previously been, the rather ugly, stupid girl who had previously been seduced by the dashing Kropotkin on both cases. And Kropotkin operates with impunity from British soil. But the guy who is ultimately behind these cases, in each case, is the same man who regrets we were not able, as the British Empire, to splinter the United States when we could have done so in the Civil War. And that is Lord Salisbury, Foreign Secretary of Britain in the 1870s and Prime Minister of Britain repeatedly from 1880 through into the 20th century. So he is the natural successor of Palmerston. And again, thank you, Richard. A very precise and crucially important question.
Just a quick follow-up, if I could, Martin,
Sure.
on your reference to the Lord Halifax and the Cecils. It's my understanding, I happen to know the 8th Marquess of Exeter, Martin Exeter, who was a head of a religious organization out of British Columbia, 100 Mile House. But his linealogy going back with the Cecils, it was my understanding that the first Marquess of Exeter was a Cecil who basically managed for Queen Elizabeth I. He was like the treasurer or manager. Yeah.
Oh,
and
completely.
so from that
In
time
fact,
forward,
Lord Cecil, the first Lord Cecil, was Prime Minister of Chancellor of England for effectively almost 40 years, and the Queen thought so much of him that she personally fed him his broth when he was dying as a mark of her care for him. And there is an extraordinary, wonderful American lady. I'll have to look Rebecca. Oh, I'll have to look up her second name. She's one of the key figures in Shakespeare was Marlowe research. And she comes to many radical conclusions which sound outrageous, but in every case where I've been able to follow them up, obviously I don't have the expertise or the resources or the primary material to either confirm or disprove. But in every case where I've been able to follow her as best I can, I find her assessments are accurate. And one of her assessments is that the line of the Cecils, which goes down to Lord Halifax, Salisbury, is not actually descended from that Lord Cecil. That, or even if it is, sorry, that the mother of his son, not the lady who brought him up, his wife, but the actual birth mother was Queen Elizabeth herself, that he was one of her illegitimate offspring, which would make Lord Salisbury in the 19th century a direct descendant of Queen Elizabeth I. And certainly Shakespeare, the man who was also Marlowe, hates the second Lord Cecil becomes first minister to the Queen on his father's death, his putative father's death, and then he becomes, until his own death, he's the first minister for King James of the first of England, who had been James VI of Scotland, right? And this is well known, there's no surprise to it. But when you look at the plays of Shakespeare / Marlowe, he hates this man. The second Lord Cecil, the Chief Chancellor of England, the Prime Minister of England under James I, is clearly the model for Richard III. They are both hunchbacks. Shakespeare can't come out and say, I hate this man as the embodiment of evil. So look, here is this old English king who all English kings since realizes the Hitler of our time, the man who killed those poor little princes in the tower, which he did. I mean, there's no question about that, for all the crackpot theories to the contrary. Richard III was a bastard. But he, I mean, not literally, physically, but in terms of being an evil, vicious son of a bitch. And he did have something of a humpback, but he didn't have much of a hunchback as far as history tells us. But who did? The Queen's minister did, and who became James I's minister. The second Lord Cecil was a hunchback. So in the Theatre of London, in the Globe, when you put this ultimate villain who Shakespeare clearly loathes above everyone else he ever wrote about in his entire extraordinary career, thou crippled fiend, thou slime, thou ugly dog, thou repulsive bag of shit. I mean, if you look at the language Queen Anne throws at him, it's delightful, it's hypnotic. It's not the Queen attacking Richard III, it's Shakespeare venting his hatred on the man who displaced the man he worshipped, who was another illegitimate son of the Queen, the Earl of Essex. If you're given the chance, I'll do another one on the secret sons of Elizabeth I and how they killed each other off. I mean, it's actually all there. You just have to, once you recognize what labels to put where, the Earl of Essex is Hamlet, and he's Richard II. He's the lovable, brilliant, charming king who Shakespeare worships, but he can never make up his mind to do anything. And so, of course, he gets beheaded or poisoned or gets a red hot poker up his behind or whatever, as Edward II did. And Shakespeare is obsessed with these characters because Hamlet is such a puzzling play. The character of Hamlet is an asshole, but clearly Shakespeare loves him, and he worships him, and everybody around Hamlet worships him, and Shakespeare expects us to worship Hamlet too. Why? Because he loved the guy who he models Hamlet on, Robert Dudley, Earl of Essex. But, look at what you've unleashed. But you're right, of course. The Cecil line is a crucially important one and a very revealing one.
All
And
right.
I guess then the round table would be picking up after that,
Sorry,
after
Richard?
Salisbury. The round table, Cecil Rhodes.
Oh, yeah. Well, that I'm no expert on, and you will know much. I would rather listen to you on that than have you listen to me. But I would be agreeing, I'm sure, and appreciating everything you had cause to say, because it is an enormously powerful force. And it was only after listening to you and Jerry and Stephen and Matt and Anton and Cynthia and all of you that I even started to look at this. And again, as you already know, it's hiding in plain sight. It's powerful. It's running the most powerful and widespread empire the human race has ever seen, which lasts longer in history than any other empire since Rome. And it's even trying ineptly to re-establish itself today by taking over Ukraine. You know, there's this new secret annex which has been leaked, which of course therefore is not reported by the BBC, but it's all over the internet, that the secret annex to the 100-year treaty between Starmer and Zelensky, between England and Britain and Ukraine, includes Britain's control of the ports and customs houses and basically import and export controls of Ukraine for the next 100 years. What is this? It's a repeat on how they enslaved China and India before that. It's actually an extraordinary attempt to recreate the 18th and 19th century mercantilist City of London empires in the 21st century. Now, it will not succeed because the Russians are there and the Chinese are there, as well as the Americans and the Europeans in their different forms, all of whom have far more clout than the English do. And the English could get away with it then because there was no one to stop them. And now there are lots of people to stop them. So, from their own point of view, this is an insanely stupid and dangerous thing to do. To use a phrase C.S. Lewis uses in That Hideous Strength, they have brought deep heaven down upon their own heads.
Well said. Okay. Peter, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Howard anticipated one question I had, which was that the successors after Lord Salisbury, Robert Cecil, were Cecil Rhodes, Lord Milner, followed by Lord Halifax, who created a lot of mischief in the 20s and the 30s, I believe. And then when you cited a not pleasing looking woman with a first name Emma, could you have meant Emma Goldman? Because I think she had.
Sorry, I did. You're right. I meant Emma Goldman. Thank you for the catch. I said Lazarus, and it's my aging memory playing it up again. I exactly meant Emma Goldman, who was very clearly a lover, and she talks about this. She isn't that explicit, but it's very clear. She worships Peter Kropotkin, and she even believes he's. Thank you, Jerry. That's exactly the book. Marlowe Up Close by Roberta Ballantyne. It's a very difficult book to read because of so much technical stuff in it. She goes into a lot of stuff on breaking codes, which may be brilliantly true, and I think it is, or it could be completely false. I'm not in a position to know, but what I do know is that whenever I have been in a position to look up any apparently outrageous allegation Roberta Ballantyne makes about Queen Elizabeth, her illegitimate children, the court around her, every time I look at it and every time I look into it, at the very minimum, I can't disprove it. It's very possible. And very more usually, it makes sense and explains otherwise utterly inexplicable events again and again and again. So thank you, Jerry. That's hugely important. But here we are talking about Emma Goldman. And Goldman very revealingly says, oh, Peter Kropotkin taught us so much. He was a scientist of genius. He put Darwin right. He proved how evolution really works. No, I'm no Darwinist. But I'm no Kropotkinist either. Nobody has ever taken Kropotkin seriously as a scientist, and that's revealing too. He was a murderer and a gangster who liked to imagine he was a great nobleman and scholar and scientist. He had the pretensions, and it was all a lie. And he fooled a lot of other people, but the biggest person, of course, he fooled was himself. But he was very clearly Emma Goldman's lover, very clearly.
Thank you, Martin.
All right. Okay. And I think that will conclude our lecture for today. I
Sure.
appreciate it very much, Marty. You, as always, okay, illuminated us and
Thank you.
I put a lot of open up a lot of different avenues of exploration, which I really appreciated. So we'll post this in the Rising Tide Foundation series of videos, and we appreciate your work so much, Marty. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's a pleasure and a privilege to work with you and all your friends and colleagues. Magdalena, thank you so much.
Thank you. And that's the end.